Queen Malidor was tired. More than anything, Queen Malidor was very, very tired. 2 years of nothing but meetings and negotiations and politics had a way of grating on anyone's nerves. It was a miracle how any of the nobles stayed sane. Well, no, that wasn't entirely right. She could count on one hand all of the nobles that were sane enough to be tolerable. Here she was, trying to repair the kingdom as best she could, and yet they still kept on speaking over her every chance they could get away with it, urging her to favor their opinions over each other's. It was maddening, the circus she was forced to deal with every single time she needed to make a domestic policy decision. At this point, Malidor had half a mind to simply say fuck it and make her own rulings. A few key policies to strip them of their power, and she would have free rein. Free rein, and suddenly several other duties on her plate, along with a dangerous precedent. They had a purpose, annoying as they were. Malidor could hardly run all the minuscule minutiae of government. Her position was one of general decisions in legislature, even if it meant she spent a good deal of her day pretending to argue with people who really should know better at this point. She should rule that all their bastard children were entitled to their inheritance. That would be a good way to watch havoc break out as people scrambled to keep their lines as pure as possible. No, that was cruel. Cruel, and a distraction she should save for later. Now, though, Malidor should be paying attention to what Lord Greyas was ranting himself hoarse about. Fittingly, he was the most vocal of his dynasty. Patriarchs held an awful lot of power. Really, though, were his words strictly a necessity? The second he realized he had managed to snag the Queen's attention, he would instantly change the topic to how his grandchildren would make excellent dauphins, his grandson especially. That, or he would complain about whatever slight he perceived her latest decision to have been. It was infuriating. Surely he understood that. Well, he had gone on for long enough about the new syllabi in the Academy of Magics. He could resolve that at the appropriate meeting, not a general one to touch base on dynastic integration and potential alterations to hiring palace staff. "If I may have silence, please." The Queen's voice carried, firm and assertive, throughout the meeting hall. As the nobles obeyed, voices quieting down, Malidor couldn't help but yearn for the sunlight streaming in through the stained glass windows. This was truly a beautiful hall, and it was a shame to be using it for such aggravating meetings as when the new programs regarding the hiring of palace staff would be put into effect. Had she been able to do this on her own, it would have been already done. Towering windows let light pour in, obsidian and gold inlays decorating the walls. The more ancient parts of the palace were always so enthralling. With the cool black metal of the table under her hands, far more ancient than any of the bloodlines gathered here today, Malidor collected her thoughts. They had gone off topic, and it was time to rein everyone back in. This policy needed to be instituted sooner rather than later. The palace was a leader for hiring practices all along the coast. So, by allowing people of mixed species employment, the rest of the city would follow. Hopefully. Very hopefully. She stood, ensuring that all eyes were on her. "Thank you. Now, if we may continue with this discussion. As we have agreed, the palace is still short on staff. Start off with something they can't argue with. The proposed solution is to consider those who are neither fully elven nor fully human. As we have established, this will introduce more job prospects and increase the standard of living throughout the city as a whole. Are there any pressing concerns that I must hear?" There were always concerns, and Malidor had to hear all of them, unfortunately. True, it was a measure to prevent another Esren, but it was also a pain. Bureaucracy was just so slow. Every day she wished it was someone else on the throne, someone who enjoyed this an iota more than her.
"I have a concern,"
Lord Greyes's reedy voice piped up as he rose, hands folded primly in front of him.
"What will you do to prevent thieving?"
Oh, like what his son did with a tapestry highlighting Queen Teniac's peace treaty with the inhabitants of the Polythalus. Rich, coming from him. Tone level and calm, Malidor met his gaze with little fanfare. Well, the bridge of his nose. It was close enough that no one noticed she wasn't making eye contact. That hasn't been an issue before, but all previous measures will remain in effect. Oh, what was the harm in being petty? Turning to her guard, Malidor tried for innocuous. Say, this conversation reminds me. Has the 1,000-year peace of Teniac turned up yet? The poor elf assigned to her went pale, all the blood draining from her face. She was new here, though that wasn't uncommon for Malidor these days. Not many were fans of being her guard, it seemed. Her husband had more luck with that. Then again, her husband's guards had to be specifically chosen to understand sign with great fluency, and a penchant for secrecy, and he was less likely to drive them away with an inability to emote properly. Malidor gave her elf another month or so, at the maximum. As much as she tried to connect with them, her guards never ended up staying for long. "No, your majesty, it is not." Fear tinged her voice, as if she hadn't expected to be addressed in this meeting. All around them, nobles did their best not to look at Lord Greyes, a couple of snickers bubbling up as his face turned the most unflattering shade of red. Really, that man was so drawn up in slights and propriety that a single deviation sent him into a conniption lasting half hours at the minimum. One of these days, he was going to forget just who he was speaking with and snap at the Queen. That was going to be more than aggravating, dealing with fallout. Maybe she could bar him from meetings for a month when that happened. "Interesting," was what she said instead. "Quite interesting. I do hope that we do not have to track it by arcane measures. It is a rather valuable work of art." Before anyone could respond, she sighed. "Why not give it a week more? I'm sure it's simply been misplaced. Now back to the question at hand. I do hope you forgive my non sequitur. We have many ways of tracking things. If push comes to shove, we will be able to locate anything missing via the Arcanium, so it wouldn't cause much trouble." Lord Greyes had the wherewithal to look slightly mollified.
"I see. What of culture, then?"
"Culture?"
"Yes, culture. Those you are considering would not have the same culture as we are accustomed to."
What a ridiculous sentiment. Shifting her skirts against the sweltering air around them, Malidor remained unreadable. "I'm afraid I don't understand your meaning, Lord Greyes. We are all of the same culture, the common folk more so. Though if you continue to worry, we can institute a similar training program as we have for the guards. The increase in tax rates would be both marginal and overshadowed by the economic opportunities provided as other businesses follow our lead. Employment rates would rise greatly, from the models I have shown you all." Money spoke, and it was that voice that silenced Lord Faladin Greyes. There was little he could do to argue with her in a way that didn't expose more of his cards than he liked. Playing innocent had its advantages, though what Malidor wouldn't overlook were his tax records. She needed to tell Galangar to take an especially close look at him. He was hiding something, and Malidor was keen on digging his secrets right back up from the closets he had buried them in. It was times like this, fielding more questions on the proposed economic impact, that she truly appreciated her husband. Mathematics came to him so easily, far more than for her, and his words were always soothing. Had he been able to speak, there would be no doubt that Malidor would have insisted he be the public face of the dynasty. It was only the two of them now. Nothing much would be different. Unfortunately, that was not to be the case. The two of them were constantly briefing each other, working in tandem to rule a country that most certainly didn't want to be ruled by the likes of them. It worked well enough, though, and served to annoy the other dynasties, as Malidor abstained from choosing a dauphin. The reasoning was simple enough. The Cadrios dynasty was not keen on being out of power, and the Cellines had no usable heirs. No way was Malidor letting her country fall apart because of a poor choice of dauphin. Her rule was an annoyance to the Cadrioses, a reminder of Isren's failure. His family had not been keen that she had not only survived the systematic incarceration, banishment, or slaughter of her dynasty, but that she had put measures in place to ensure it never happened again. Funnily enough, Malidor was living up to the fears people had had of an Iridian on the throne. There wouldn't be any more after her. Wasn't that fortunate? All this resistance was such a waste of energy. Surely the noble families should have learned how effective her policies had been. For the first time in 2 centuries, unemployment had fallen across the board in all territories and regions. Non-standard species and crosses were suddenly finding jobs closer to the heart of the kingdom, rather than needing to emigrate further west. Increased tolerance, too, was a benefit, not a detriment. Slowly, but surely, people were coming out of the woodwork to live their lives. Humanish people were willing to be outside more often, though wearing veils to mitigate the brunt of the stares had become incredibly common. Half-elves were able to start up their businesses under their own names rather than a purebred partner's. Half-orcs let the roots of their hair grow out, and were less religious on filing down their tusks. Like a switch had been flipped. Blending in was not of utmost importance anymore. It was a good sign. Despite what every other noble decried, this was a very good sign. Hopefully a few of the restaurants serving less standard cuisine would draw the heavy curtains from their windows when they realized neither they nor their patrons were to be penalized for being so bold as to serve and eat recipes from the Northwest Territories, or Centralia, or the Sand Wastes. One could only dream. With a quiet sigh, Malidor refocused her attention. The Cellene matriarch was rising to speak, smile sly on her face. Oh, this should be interesting. The Cellene dynasty was not known for having their fingers in many pies at all. Most of their comments came regarding taxation or education, not on economics or social reform. The bulk of their time was spent following along with something that could have just as easily been summarized in a report. But here Nadja Cellene was, pale green eyes languidly watching her queen, blonde hair pulled back in complex braids. It was unnerving, though Malidor would never show it. Why did there have to be so much eye contact nowadays? "My queen." She spoke like a shark swimming through water. "Forgive me for my presumptiveness, but it seems to me that you have thought deeply on this matter, and I, for one, support you in this. It is incredibly important to address the inequalities present in our society, and work to leveling them." That was not what Malidor had expected to hear from the matriarch of the Cellines. Judging from the disguised surprise on faces all around the room, no one else had expected that, not even Nadja's own dynasty. She was never one to speak out against much of anything, not in Malidor's reign, and certainly not in Isren's, falling into line as she saw fit. That there wasn't a trace of doubt in her voice. What game was she playing? And against whom? "And, in the same vein of thought," a grin was just barely wrangled back into a smile, "I would like to introduce the newest member of the Cellene dynasty. Hakion, please rise." Gods and men. Gods and motherfucking men. That bastard woman. All of the air blew out of the room as a young man stood, a new face that Malidor had initially assumed was an apprentice to someone daring enough to comply with their queen's suggestions. His skin was creamy, a faint green tint hinting at some Orcic ancestry. Black hair had been braided back, showing off clipped ears and cool silver eyes, ringed with a dark band across the iris, indicative of a half-orc parent, though no tusks poked out from his bottom lip. Had Malidor not been looking closely, she would have thought him a human with a sickly pallor and some distant Orcic breeding. So, Nadja had an affair some 30 years ago. Good for her. The matriarch rested her hand on his upper back with a fondness she was unable to hide.
This is my son, and from this day forth he will be asserting his rightful place in this dynasty. Again, thank you, my queen, for all you have done. I would simply like to reaffirm my support for this cause and introduce a new face. Hekion will henceforth be attending meetings, as is his right as a child of the dynasty. I trust this will not cause issue.
The other nobles were going to die of something. Lord Greyes looked as if he were mere seconds away from a heart attack, his son's eyes bugging out as he stared at the poor boy. For his part, Hekion held up well, presenting himself with as much grace and respect as he could. This was likely not what he had signed up for initially. Of course it will not. Malidor inclined her head at him politely. It is a pleasure to meet you, Lord Hekion, and I am eager to see what you will become in due time. He smiled back at her, his hands clasped in front of him. The pleasure is all mine, your majesty. I am indebted to you, though I will endeavor to make it up post-haste. Thank you for all of the opportunities you have provided, and for your support. It is no trouble at all. Thank you, Lord Nadja, for your statement, and congratulations on your new member. I pray you will find joy in your futures. With a motion for Hekion to sit, Nadja continued, resting her hand on his shoulder. Possessive, was she?
Again, I thank you, my queen. As you have previously said, times are changing, and it is time we change with them.
Sputtering, the heir apparent of the Kadrios dynasty rushed to his feet in all his misplaced passion and useless spite. The man was young, and yet far too old to be getting into arguments like this and expecting a chance of winning. His temper was only partially the reason Malidor would not be selecting him as her Dauphin.
My queen, surely you can't allow this!
Another reason. It seemed he was just strengthening her arguments these days with outbursts like this. Lord Greyes knew that well enough. His glance would have set his son aflame had the boy turned to look. Despite his protests, the patriarch knew better than to publicly challenge his queen, especially not when economic success was on the line. For all he waffled and scoffed at her inclusion policies, he was more than aware of the boost it caused as new sectors of people found work. A strong economy meant a higher quality of life, after all. This was different, though. Theolan Kydros had not only challenged another dynasty, but also his queen. In a different era, this would have been a death sentence. Well, it seemed that Malidor simply didn't have the presence of her predecessor. That, or Theolan, was both an idiot and a fool. With her track record, Malidor was leaning rather strongly to the second. Before she could speak, she caught sight of how Nadja seethed under her mask of indifference.
Greyes!
An unusual edge laced her voice, unexpected coming from her.
Control your boy, lest his tongue be your undoing.
Someone get the popcorn. Lord Greyes took the bait, snapping back.
Control my boy? Why, Nadja, that's quite the statement coming from you, a woman that could not even control herself.
Nadja's teeth ground as Hekion's head jerked up, fixing Lord Greyes's son with a glare that could melt snow in the dead of winter. He got that from his mother. Though it was interesting the subtext there, the way Theolan swallowed, ears consciously held still so as not to betray emotions.
I should say, Greyes, that you are mightily bold for a man whose heir apparent is not even his.
All right, that was too far. Malidor was all for catfights when they tore apart each other's politics,
but her patience stretched when they took up valuable time squabbling about affairs. She had other things to get to, things that were more important than a vote on castle staff.
"That is enough."
A queen didn't need to speak up to be heard, but, evidently, Lords Greyes and Nadja hadn't learned that lesson. The two of them kept up their bickering, more than content to transform it into a screaming match. Lovely. Just lovely. A vein popped out of Lord Greyes's forehead, and his son had turned a rather impressive shade of red at the mention of his parentage. That was certainly the worst-kept secret in the entire court, though that was neither important nor appropriate to discuss at the moment. Loud enough that all could hear, Malidor repeated herself.
"That is enough!"
Well, that certainly got everyone to fall silent. Malidor did not yell often. It was not befitting of a queen to rely on raising her voice, but, in some cases, situations called for it. This one certainly did. The sentiment didn't stop the pang of guilt as attendants and guards alike flinched at her tone, eyes wide with terror. Not just the guards. A few members of the dynasties shrank into their seats, gazes fixed on their queen while their minds recounted what had happened when monarchs needed to restore order. It wasn't all that long ago that a screaming monarch was the preamble to a rash of executions. The squabbling lords had snapped their mouths shut, attentions wholly fixed on her, an uncanny exactness in their eyes. Had she not known better, Malidor would have felt that she had fallen into a trap. "Please." Returning her voice to its normal, placid tone, Malidor couldn't help but wince at how it rasped. "That is more than enough. We are not children, bickering amongst ourselves over toys. Both of your statements were out of line. Please issue apologies to those involved like mature adults." "I apologize, Lord Greyes." Nadja's eyes still flicked to Malidor as if the queen were to strangle her herself. It was silly. Malidor was not a strangler. "I did not mean to insult. My words were said in the heat of anger, and I will endeavor not to repeat my error." Lord Greyes was less trustful of his queen. Frowns set deep enough that it added wrinkles to his face. "I apologize as well, Lord Nadja. I should not have been so rude. I will not repeat such statements in the future." "Thank you." Motioning for the two of them to be seated, Malidor turned her gaze to the boy. "Lord Theolen, have you anything to say?" The gears in his brain were visibly spinning as he tried for the correct answer. "I apologize for my outburst, my queen. I swear to you that will never happen again. And I humble myself before you." "Not the point." "Thank you, Lord Theolen, but I am not the person you should be apologizing to." That got the message across. As he opened his mouth to protest, his father smacked him upside the head, hissing quiet words into the boy's ear. It really wasn't necessary, in Malidor's opinion. But what did she know of child-rearing? There was little she could do to stop Lord Greyes from disciplining his own heir, especially for such a severe mistake. Really, what had he been thinking? Had he been thinking at all? Thoroughly mollified, Theolen turned to Hekion, cheeks burning redder. How did he manage to be so pink? Was it a medical condition? Could one die of blushing too much? "I apologize for my actions." It was as if she were making him eat shards of glass. "It was out of line, and I should not have said such cruel things. I understand that we are both adults, and that we should act as such. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me for my foolishness." "Thank you for your apology." Hekion spoke. His voice wasn't what Malidor had expected, really. Instead of the low rasp of his mother, his words were smooth and sonorous, the after-effects of a lifetime practicing choral work. Interesting. Very interesting. "I do hope that this will not taint our relationship.
It is important for a court to run without error and fault, regardless of personal feelings.
Smart boy. He had likely been fed that line, but smart boy nonetheless for sounding like he believed it.
Thank you both. All may be seated.
They obliged her, Theolin's eyes fixed firmly on his lap.
Now, may we please put this measure up to a vote? I believe we have dallied long enough. Dynasties in favor of passing the new employment guidelines?
She raised her hand, watching as Nadja and Lord Greyes did the same, faces dark. Useful, if an argument would get them both in line, despite their personal feelings on the matter. The two of them were getting close, dangerously so, considering they had taken such pains to hide it. Hopefully there wouldn't be another pregnancy announcement any time soon. The two of them, distilled into one child, would haunt her nightmares for years to come.
All against?
She heard herself say. No hands raised.
Any final objections?
Silence. Good. This measure has passed. The palace will now institute more diverse hiring practices. Thank you all for your attendance to this meeting. I do hope you all have a nice day. Lord Nadja, congratulations again on the addition of your son. Goodbyes were said, while Malidor gathered up her things and smoothed down her skirt, standing. There were far too many other things on her schedule today. People to meet, hands to shake, and babies to kiss. At least this evening she would have something exciting to tell Galangar. He always loved it when the nobles fought. Guard in tow, she set off, shoes clicking against the ornate tiled floors. As the doors closed behind her, the sound of a new argument breaking out graced her ears. Something to look forward to reading about later, she thought without much enthusiasm. Something to look forward to.